I was lucky. Was I lucky? I wasn't lucky. He was lucky. Was he lucky? He wasn't lucky. She was lucky. Was she lucky? She wasn't lucky. You were lucky. Were you lucky? You weren't lucky. We were lucky. Were we lucky? We weren't lucky. They were lucky. Were they lucky? They weren't lucky. I was rich. Was I rich? I wasn't rich. He was rich. Was he rich? He wasn't rich. She was rich. Was she rich? She wasn't rich. You were rich. Were you rich? You weren't rich. We were rich. Were we rich? We weren't rich. They were rich. Were they rich? They weren't rich. I was wealthy. Was I wealthy? I wasn't wealthy. He was wealthy. Was he wealthy? He wasn't wealthy. She was wealthy. Was she wealthy? She wasn't wealthy. You were wealthy. Were you wealthy? You weren't wealthy. We were wealthy. Were we wealthy? We weren't wealthy. They were wealthy. Were they wealthy? They weren't wealthy. I was healthy. Was I healthy? I wasn't healthy. He was healthy. Was he healthy? He wasn't healthy. She was healthy. Was she healthy? She wasn't healthy. You were healthy. Were you healthy? You weren't healthy. We were healthy. Were we healthy? We weren't healthy. They were healthy. Were they healthy? They weren't healthy. I was lazy. Was I lazy? I wasn't lazy. He was lazy. Was he lazy? He wasn't lazy. She was lazy. Was she lazy? She wasn't lazy. You were lazy. Were you lazy? You weren't lazy. We were lazy. Were we lazy? We weren't lazy. They were lazy. Were they lazy? They weren't lazy. I was hardworking. Was I hardworking? I wasn't hardworking. He was hardworking. Was he hardworking? He wasn't hardworking. She was hardworking. Was she hardworking? She wasn't hardworking. You were hardworking. Were you hardworking? You weren't hardworking. We were hardworking. Were we hardworking? We weren't hardworking. They were hardworking. Were they hardworking? They weren't hardworking. I was poor. Was I poor? I wasn't poor. He was poor. Was he poor? He wasn't poor. She was poor. Was she poor? She wasn't poor. You were poor. Were you poor? You weren't poor. We were poor. Were we poor? We weren't poor. They were poor. Were they poor? They weren't poor. I was happy. Was I happy? I wasn't happy. He was happy. Was he happy? He wasn't happy. She was happy. Was she happy? She wasn't happy. You were happy. Were you happy? You weren't happy. We were happy. Were we happy? We weren't happy. They were happy. Were they happy? They weren't happy. I was unhappy. Was I unhappy? I wasn't unhappy. He was unhappy. Was he unhappy? He wasn't unhappy. She was unhappy. Was she unhappy? She wasn't unhappy. You were unhappy. Were you unhappy? You weren't unhappy. We were unhappy. Were we unhappy? We weren't unhappy. They were unhappy. Were they unhappy? They weren't unhappy. I was sad. Was I sad? I wasn't sad. He was sad. Was he sad? He wasn't sad. She was sad. Was she sad? She wasn't sad. You were sad. Were you sad? You weren't sad. We were sad. Were we sad? We weren't sad. They were sad. Were they sad? They weren't sad. I was ill. Was I ill? I wasn't ill. He was ill. Was he ill? He wasn't ill. She was ill. Was she ill? She wasn't ill. You were ill. Were you ill? You weren't ill. We were ill. Were we ill? We weren't ill. They were ill. Were they ill? They weren't ill. I was glad. Was I glad? I wasn't glad. He was glad. Was he glad? He wasn't glad. She was glad. Was she glad? She wasn't glad. You were glad. Were you glad? You weren't glad. We were glad. Were we glad? We weren't glad. They were glad. Were they glad? They weren't glad. I was clever. Was I clever? I wasn't clever. He was clever. Was he clever? He wasn't clever. She was clever. Was she clever? She wasn't clever. You were clever. Were you clever? You weren't clever. We were clever. Were we clever? We weren't clever. They were clever. Were they clever? They weren't clever. I was stupid. Was I stupid? I wasn't stupid. He was stupid. Was he stupid? He wasn't stupid. She was stupid. Was she stupid? She wasn't stupid. You were stupid. Were you stupid? You weren't stupid. We were stupid. Were we stupid? We weren't stupid. They were stupid. Were they stupid? They weren't stupid. I was upset. Was I upset? I wasn't upset. He was upset. Was he upset? He wasn't upset. She was upset. Was she upset? She wasn't upset. You were upset. Were you upset? You weren't upset. We were upset. Were we upset? We weren't upset. They were upset. Were they upset? They weren't upset. I was strong. Was I strong? I wasn't strong. He was strong. Was he strong? He wasn't strong. She was strong. Was she strong? She wasn't strong. You were strong. Were you strong? You weren't strong. We were strong. Were we strong? We weren't strong. They were strong. Were they strong? They weren't strong. I was weak. Was I weak? I wasn't weak. He was weak. Was he weak? He wasn't weak. She was weak. Was she weak? She wasn't weak. You were weak. Were you weak? You weren't weak. We were weak. Were we weak? We weren't weak. They were weak. Were they weak? They weren't weak. I was shy. Was I shy? I wasn't shy. He was shy. Was he shy? He wasn't shy. She was shy. Was she shy? She wasn't shy. You were shy. Were you shy? You weren't shy. We were shy. Were we shy? We weren't shy. They were shy. Were they shy? They weren't shy. I was tired. Was I tired? I wasn't tired. He was tired. Was he tired? He wasn't tired. She was tired. Was she tired? She wasn't tired. You were tired. Were you tired? You weren't tired. We were tired. Were we tired? We weren't tired. They were tired. Were they tired? They weren't tired. I was young. Was I young? I wasn't young. He was young. Was he young? He wasn't young. She was young. Was she young? She wasn't young. You were young. Were you young? You weren't young. We were young. Were we young? We weren't young. They were young. Were they young? They weren't young. I was old. Was I old? I wasn't old. He was old. Was he old? He wasn't old. She was old. Was she old? She wasn't old. You were old. Were you old? You weren't old. We were old. Were we old? We weren't old. They were old. Were they old? They weren't old. I was beautiful. Was I beautiful? I wasn't beautiful. He was handsome. Was he handsome? He wasn't handsome. She was beautiful. Was she beautiful? She wasn't beautiful. You were beautiful. Were you beautiful? You weren't beautiful. We were beautiful. Were we beautiful? We weren't beautiful. They were beautiful. Were they beautiful? They weren't beautiful. I was kind. Was I kind? I wasn't kind. He was kind. Was he kind? He wasn't kind. She was kind. Was she kind? She wasn't kind. You were kind. Were you kind? You weren't kind. We were kind. Were we kind? We weren't kind. They were kind. Were they kind? They weren't kind. I was mean. Was I mean? I wasn't mean. He was mean. Was he mean? He wasn't mean. She was mean. Was she mean? She wasn't mean. You were mean. Were you mean? You weren't mean. We were mean. Were we mean? We weren't mean. They were mean. Were they mean? They weren't mean. I was funny. Was I funny? I wasn't funny. He was funny. Was he funny? He wasn't funny. She was funny. Was she funny? She wasn't funny. You were funny. Were you funny? You weren't funny. We were funny. Were we funny? We weren't funny. They were funny. Were they funny? They weren't funny. I was humble. Was I humble? I wasn't humble. He was humble. Was he humble? He wasn't humble. She was humble. Was she humble? She wasn't humble. You were humble. Were you humble? You weren't humble. We were humble. Were we humble? We weren't humble. They were humble. Were they humble? They weren't humble. I was experienced. Was I experienced? I wasn't experienced. He was experienced. Was he experienced? He wasn't experienced. She was experienced. Was she experienced? She wasn't experienced. You were experienced. Were you experienced? You weren't experienced. We were experienced. Were we experienced? We weren't experienced. They were experienced. Were they experienced? They weren't experienced. I was inexperienced. Was I inexperienced? I wasn't inexperienced. He was inexperienced. Was he inexperienced? He wasn't inexperienced. She was inexperienced. Was she inexperienced? She wasn't inexperienced. You were inexperienced. Were you inexperienced? You weren't inexperienced. We were inexperienced. Were we inexperienced? We weren't inexperienced. They were inexperienced. Were they inexperienced? They weren't inexperienced. I was skilled. Was I skilled? I wasn't skilled. He was skilled. Was he skilled? He wasn't skilled. She was skilled. Was she skilled? She wasn't skilled. You were skilled. Were you skilled? You weren't skilled. We were skilled. Were we skilled? We weren't skilled. They were skilled. Were they skilled? They weren't skilled. I was surprised. Was I surprised? I wasn't surprised. He was surprised. Was he surprised? He wasn't surprised. She was surprised. Was she surprised? She wasn't surprised. You were surprised. Were you surprised? You weren't surprised. We were surprised. Were we surprised? We weren't surprised. They were surprised. Were they surprised? They weren't surprised. I was jealous. Was I jealous? I wasn't jealous. He was jealous. Was he jealous? He wasn't jealous. She was jealous. Was she jealous? She wasn't jealous. You were jealous. Were you jealous? You weren't jealous. We were jealous. Were we jealous? We weren't jealous. They were jealous. Were they jealous? They weren't jealous. I was married. Was I married? I wasn't married. He was married. Was he married? He wasn't married. She was married. Was she married? She wasn't married. You were married. Were you married? You weren't married. We were married. Were we married? We weren't married. They were married. Were they married? They weren't married. I was engaged. Was I engaged? I wasn't engaged. He was engaged. Was he engaged? He wasn't engaged. She was engaged. Was she engaged? She wasn't engaged. You were engaged. Were you engaged? You weren't engaged. We were engaged. Were we engaged? We weren't engaged. They were engaged. Were they engaged? They weren't engaged. I was cautious. Was I cautious? I wasn't cautious. He was cautious. Was he cautious? He wasn't cautious. She was cautious. Was she cautious? She wasn't cautious. You were cautious. Were you cautious? You weren't cautious. We were cautious. Were we cautious? We weren't cautious. They were cautious. Were they cautious? They weren't cautious. I was busy. Was I busy? I wasn't busy. He was busy. Was he busy? He wasn't busy. She was busy. Was she busy? She wasn't busy. You were busy. Were you busy? You weren't busy. We were busy. Were we busy? We weren't busy. They were busy. Were they busy? They weren't busy. I was free. Was I free? I wasn't free. He was free. Was he free? He wasn't free. She was free. Was she free? She wasn't free. You were free. Were you free? You weren't free. We were free. Were we free? We weren't free. They were free. Were they free? They weren't free. I was hungry. Was I hungry? I wasn't hungry. He was hungry. Was he hungry? He wasn't hungry. She was hungry. Was she hungry? She wasn't hungry. You were hungry. Were you hungry? You weren't hungry. We were hungry. Were we hungry? We weren't hungry. They were hungry. Were they hungry? They weren't hungry. I was thirsty. Was I thirsty? I wasn't thirsty. He was thirsty. Was he thirsty? He wasn't thirsty. She was thirsty. Was she thirsty? She wasn't thirsty. You were thirsty. Were you thirsty? You weren't thirsty. We were thirsty. Were we thirsty? We weren't thirsty. They were thirsty. Were they thirsty? They weren't thirsty. I was angry. Was I angry? I wasn't angry. He was angry. Was he angry? He wasn't angry. She was angry. Was she angry? She wasn't angry. You were angry. Were you angry? You weren't angry. We were angry. Were we angry? We weren't angry. They were angry. Were they angry? They weren't angry. I was sleepy. Was I sleepy? I wasn't sleepy. He was sleepy. Was he sleepy? He wasn't sleepy. She was sleepy. Was she sleepy? She wasn't sleepy. You were sleepy. Were you sleepy? You weren't sleepy. We were sleepy. Were we sleepy? We weren't sleepy. They were sleepy. Were they sleepy? They weren't sleepy. I was silly. Was I silly? I wasn't silly. He was silly. Was he silly? He wasn't silly. She was silly. Was she silly? She wasn't silly. You were silly. Were you silly? You weren't silly. We were silly. Were we silly? We weren't silly. They were silly. Were they silly? They weren't silly. I was wise. Was I wise? I wasn't wise. He was wise. Was he wise? He wasn't wise. She was wise. Was she wise? She wasn't wise. You were wise. Were you wise? You weren't wise. We were wise. Were we wise? We weren't wise. They were wise. Were they wise? They weren't wise. I was excited. Was I excited? I wasn't excited. He was excited. Was he excited? He wasn't excited. She was excited. Was she excited? She wasn't excited. You were excited. Were you excited? You weren't excited. We were excited. Were we excited? We weren't excited. They were excited. Were they excited? They weren't excited. I was homeless. Was I homeless? I wasn't homeless. He was homeless. Was he homeless? He wasn't homeless. She was homeless. Was she homeless? She wasn't homeless. You were homeless. Were you homeless? You weren't homeless. We were homeless. Were we homeless? We weren't homeless. They were homeless. Were they homeless? They weren't homeless. I was brave. Was I brave? I wasn't brave. He was brave. Was he brave? He wasn't brave. She was brave. Was she brave? She wasn't brave. You were brave. Were you brave? You weren't brave. We were brave. Were we brave? We weren't brave. They were brave. Were they brave? They weren't brave. I was safe. Was I safe? I wasn't safe. He was safe. Was he safe? He wasn't safe. She was safe. Was she safe? She wasn't safe. You were safe. Were you safe? You weren't safe. We were safe. Were we safe? We weren't safe. They were safe. Were they safe? They weren't safe. I was attractive. Was I attractive? I wasn't attractive. He was attractive. Was he attractive? He wasn't attractive. She was attractive. Was she attractive? She wasn't attractive. You were attractive. Were you attractive? You weren't attractive. We were attractive. Were we attractive? We weren't attractive. They were attractive. Were they attractive? They weren't attractive. I was successful. Was I successful? I wasn't successful. He was successful. Was he successful? He wasn't successful. She was successful. Was she successful? She wasn't successful. You were successful. Were you successful? You weren't successful. We were successful. Were we successful? We weren't successful. They were successful. Were they successful? They weren't successful. I was tall. Was I tall? I wasn't tall. He was tall. Was he tall? He wasn't tall. She was tall. Was she tall? She wasn't tall. You were tall. Were you tall? You weren't tall. We were tall. Were we tall? We weren't tall. They were tall. Were they tall? They weren't tall. I was stingy. Was I stingy? I wasn't stingy. He was stingy. Was he stingy? He wasn't stingy. She was stingy. Was she stingy? She wasn't stingy. You were stingy. Were you stingy? You weren't stingy. We were stingy. Were we stingy? We weren't stingy. They were stingy. Were they stingy? They weren't stingy. I was crazy. Was I crazy? I wasn't crazy. He was crazy. Was he crazy? He wasn't crazy. She was crazy. Was she crazy? She wasn't crazy. You were crazy. Were you crazy? You weren't crazy. We were crazy. Were we crazy? We weren't crazy. They were crazy. Were they crazy? They weren't crazy. I was gifted. Was I gifted? I wasn't gifted. He was gifted. Was he gifted? He wasn't gifted. She was gifted. Was she gifted? She wasn't gifted. You were gifted. Were you gifted? You weren't gifted. We were gifted. Were we gifted? We weren't gifted. They were gifted. Were they gifted? They weren't gifted. I was talented. Was I talented? I wasn't talented. He was talented. Was he talented? He wasn't talented. She was talented. Was she talented? She wasn't talented. You were talented. Were you talented? You weren't talented. We were talented. Were we talented? We weren't talented. They were talented. Were they talented? They weren't talented. I was exhausted. Was I exhausted? I wasn't exhausted. He was exhausted. Was he exhausted? He wasn't exhausted. She was exhausted. Was she exhausted? She wasn't exhausted. You were exhausted. Were you exhausted? You weren't exhausted. We were exhausted. Were we exhausted? We weren't exhausted. They were exhausted. Were they exhausted? They weren't exhausted. I was loyal. Was I loyal? I wasn't loyal. He was loyal. Was he loyal? He wasn't loyal. She was loyal. Was she loyal? She wasn't loyal. You were loyal. Were you loyal? You weren't loyal. We were loyal. Were we loyal? We weren't loyal. They were loyal. Were they loyal? They weren't loyal. I was hired. Was I hired? I wasn't hired. He was hired. Was he hired? He wasn't hired. She was hired. Was she hired? She wasn't hired. You were hired. Were you hired? You weren't hired. We were hired. Were we hired? We weren't hired. They were hired. Were they hired? They weren't hired. I was fired. Was I fired? I wasn't fired. He was fired. Was he fired? He wasn't fired. She was fired. Was she fired? She wasn't fired. You were fired. Were you fired? You weren't fired. We were fired. Were we fired? We weren't fired. They were fired. Were they fired? They weren't fired. I was powerful. Was I powerful? I wasn't powerful. He was powerful. Was he powerful? He wasn't powerful. She was powerful. Was she powerful? She wasn't powerful. You were powerful. Were you powerful? You weren't powerful. We were powerful. Were we powerful? We weren't powerful. They were powerful. Were they powerful? They weren't powerful. I was fair. Was I fair? I wasn't fair. He was fair. Was he fair? He wasn't fair. She was fair. Was she fair? She wasn't fair. You were fair. Were you fair? You weren't fair. We were fair. Were we fair? We weren't fair. They were fair. Were they fair? They weren't fair. I was serious. Was I serious? I wasn't serious. He was serious. Was he serious? He wasn't serious. She was serious. Was she serious? She wasn't serious. You were serious. Were you serious? You weren't serious. We were serious. Were we serious? We weren't serious. They were serious. Were they serious? They weren't serious. I was responsible. Was I responsible? I wasn't responsible. He was responsible. Was he responsible? He wasn't responsible. She was responsible. Was she responsible? She wasn't responsible. You were responsible. Were you responsible? You weren't responsible. We were responsible. Were we responsible? We weren't responsible. They were responsible. Were they responsible? They weren't responsible.